The television courtroom had never witnessed such pure, unfiltered arrogance from someone who had spent decades abusing positions of trust and authority. Karen Bishop, self-proclaimed community leader and owner of Bishop Security and Youth Services, stood before America's most feared TV judge with the kind of smug confidence that could only come from years of exploiting her fake badges and religious authority to prey on innocent families without consequence. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed directly at Judge Judy as the words that would destroy her criminal empire forever spilled from her lips. "You're being stupid, Judge. You clearly don't understand how authority and leadership work." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed into the kind of death stare that had made grown attorneys wet themselves on national television. But what happened next would leave the entire audience speechless and turn Karen Bishop from respected authority figure into the most hated woman in America. Karen had walked into that courtroom believing she was untouchable. After all, she had been running her multifaceted criminal operation for 15 years, using fake police credentials to conduct illegal traffic stops, operating as a corrupt security guard to steal from wealthy clients, coaching youth sports teams to abuse minors and commit scholarship fraud, and leading a religious congregation while embezzling hundreds of thousands in donations. She had destroyed childhoods, bankrupted families, and violated the sacred trust that communities place in authority figures with nothing more than forged badges, fake uniforms, and the manipulative charm of a career predator. Today was supposed to be just another easy victory, another chance to intimidate a victim who had dared to report her theft and assault. She had no idea that Judge Judy had spent the previous night digging through police databases, coaching association records, IRS fraud investigations, and criminal background checks spanning multiple decades. She had no idea that the woman she had just called stupid knew secrets about her past that could send her to federal prison for life. The plaintiff, Marcus Williams, sat trembling in his chair, clutching a folder full of police reports and documentation that had turned his trust in Karen's security services into a nightmare. For 8 months, Karen had been providing security for Marcus's successful construction company, using her fake police credentials and professional demeanor to gain access to his offices, employee records, and financial information. Instead of protecting his business, she had been systematically stealing equipment, intimidating his workers with fake arrests, and embezzling money from his accounts while threatening anyone who questioned her authority. The $45,000 in stolen property and fraudulent charges had nearly destroyed his family business that had taken him 20 years to build. Behind Marcus sat 3 other victims who had traveled across the country to witness this moment. Sarah Chen, whose 14-year-old son had been sexually abused by Karen during basketball coaching sessions where she used her authority to silence him with threats of ruining his scholarship opportunities. Robert Martinez, whose daughter had been subjected to illegal traffic stops and strip searches when Karen impersonated a police officer to terrorize teenage drivers in his neighborhood, and Pastor David Thompson, whose entire congregation had been financially devastated when they discovered Karen had stolen $280,000 from their building fund while serving as their ordained minister and financial advisor. But Marcus had finally found the courage to fight back. He had no idea he was about to witness the most savage judicial takedown of an authority figure predator in television history. Judge Judy leaned back in her chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. In 35 years of jurisprudence, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot corrupt authority figures, badge-wearing predators, and religious con artists within the first 30 seconds of meeting them. Karen Bishop had triggered every single one of her alarm bells the moment she walked through the door. The entitled posture when describing her law enforcement background, the dismissive attitude toward the plaintiff's business losses, the casual way she invoked her religious authority to justify her actions. It all pointed to someone with a much darker past than legitimate community leadership, and Judge Judy's research had confirmed her worst fears about what happens when psychopaths gain positions of trust and authority. The courtroom atmosphere was electric with tension. The audience members, mostly working-class Americans who had learned to respect authority figures, sensed something different about this case. Karen's opening statement had been a masterclass in manipulation and intimidation, describing Marcus Williams as the type of business owner who doesn't understand the necessity of proper security protocols, and claiming that his financial losses were due to poor business management and failure to appreciate professional law enforcement services. She had rolled her eyes at Marcus's emotional testimony about the fear and paranoia that had consumed his workplace after months of Karen's psychological terrorism, dismissing his concerns as typical criminal complaints from someone who got caught breaking the law. The audience's murmurs of disapproval had only made Karen more defiant, more certain that she was the victim of criminals who couldn't appreciate legitimate authority and professional law enforcement. Judge Judy had listened to Karen's testimony with the patience of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She had asked seemingly innocent questions about Karen's law enforcement credentials, her coaching certifications, her religious ordination. Karen had answered with increasing arrogance, clearly believing she was educating this stupid judge about the realities of maintaining order and authority in modern society. When Judge Judy had pressed her on the stolen equipment and why she had been conducting traffic stops without proper jurisdiction, Karen had made her fatal mistake. "Judge, with all due respect, you're being stupid. These people need to understand that real authority requires decisive action. Maybe if you understood law enforcement and community leadership instead of just being a TV judge, you'd see that I'm protecting society from criminals and maintaining the moral order that keeps communities safe." The words had barely finished leaving her mouth before she realized that something had fundamentally shifted in the room. What Karen didn't know was that Judge Judy had been handling cases involving corrupt authority figures for decades with a particular hatred for predators who used badges, uniforms, and religious authority to exploit innocent victims. What she didn't know was that Judge Judy's research team had uncovered a pattern of criminal behavior that involved federal agencies, multiple state investigations, and victims spanning over 2 decades. What she didn't know was that calling Judge Judy stupid was about to trigger the most devastating criminal background revelation in courtroom television history, one that would expose her as not just a corrupt authority figure, but a career predator who had been systematically abusing positions of trust to commit some of the most heinous crimes imaginable. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen Bishop sat in the defendant's chair with the posture of someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions. Her fake police uniform accessories and religious jewelry displayed like armor against the growing hostility from the audience. She had no idea that she was sitting on a ticking time bomb that Judge Judy was about to detonate. This was supposed to be a simple case about security service theft. Marcus Williams had hired what Karen advertised as professional law enforcement security with certified officers and comprehensive protection services. Instead, he had unknowingly invited a career criminal into his business who used her fake authority to systematically loot his company while psychologically terrorizing his employees with threats of arrest and deportation. The theft had become Karen's excuse to demonstrate the full extent of her criminal expertise. She had obtained fraudulent police credentials by bribing corrupt officials and forging documents that enabled her to purchase real law enforcement equipment and vehicles. She had used her fake authority to conduct illegal searches of Marcus's premises, accessing his financial records and employee information that she used for identity theft and blackmail schemes. She had threatened his workers with deportation and arrest if they reported her behavior, creating an atmosphere of fear that allowed her to operate with impunity. But this case represented something much larger than theft and impersonation. This was about a criminal enterprise that had been destroying lives for over 20 years, using society's respect for authority figures to gain access to the most vulnerable victims: children who trusted coaches with their athletic dreams, drivers who complied with fake traffic stops out of respect for law enforcement, religious families who entrusted their life savings to spiritual leaders. The devastation couldn't have been more complete for the Williams family. Marcus had built his construction business from nothing, working 18-hour days for 20 years to create jobs for dozens of immigrant workers who depended on him for their livelihoods. Karen's theft and intimidation had not only cost him financially but had created legal problems with immigration authorities who investigated his business after her fake arrests of his employees. The $45,000 in direct losses had been compounded by legal fees, lost contracts, and the psychological trauma of realizing he had been completely deceived by someone he trusted with his family's security. His wife Maria had been forced to take a second job to help recover from the financial damage, while their teenage children lived in fear that Karen might return to carry out her threats against the family. The business that had been Marcus's pride and legacy was now struggling to survive the reputation damage and financial losses caused by Karen's criminal operation. What made this case truly explosive was what Karen didn't know about Judge Judy's preparation. While Karen had been expecting a typical TV court appearance where she could use her authority figure persona to intimidate and manipulate, Judge Judy had been conducting the kind of investigation that would make federal task forces proud. Phone calls to real police departments where Karen had impersonated officers, deep dives into coaching association records that revealed a pattern of abuse complaints and dismissed allegations, conversations with former congregation members who had discovered their donations funding Karen's personal lifestyle while she preached about moral purity. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of someone who had been running systematic authority abuse operations for decades, someone whose criminal behavior went far beyond simple theft into territory that was genuinely organized predation. Karen Bishop, at 52 years old, had spent the better part of 3 decades perfecting the art of authority figure fraud. Born into a middle-class family in suburban Ohio, she had always been fascinated by the power that uniforms, badges, and titles gave people over others. Her first taste of criminal success came during her brief legitimate employment as a mall security guard, where she discovered that people were incredibly deferential to anyone wearing a uniform, and that authority figures faced minimal oversight in their interactions with the public. When she established her criminal operation 15 years ago, Karen had already perfected her methodology through years of smaller-scale authority abuse in various legitimate positions. She had learned to structure her crimes to maximize access to victims while minimizing accountability, understanding that people were reluctant to challenge authority figures and that different agencies rarely communicated about suspicious behavior patterns. What made Karen truly dangerous was her combination of superficial charm and complete willingness to exploit society's most sacred trusts. She had studied every aspect of authority figure fraud: credential forgery, uniform acquisition, legal loopholes, victim intimidation, and had developed sophisticated methods for targeting communities that were least likely to question her authority or successfully report her crimes. Her criminal enterprise had victimized over 500 people across multiple states, stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars while psychologically and physically abusing victims who trusted her because of her apparent authority. Marcus Williams represented everything Karen had learned to exploit during her criminal career. A hard-working immigrant entrepreneur who had achieved the American dream through honest labor, Marcus embodied the respect for authority that Karen viewed as an opportunity for maximum exploitation. His limited English and fear of government agencies made him vulnerable to intimidation tactics, while his successful business provided the financial target that motivated her crimes. Judge Judy Schindlin, at 78 years old, had built her reputation on an almost supernatural ability to detect corrupt authority figures and systematic predators. Her path to television fame had been paved with decades of handling cases involving the most heinous abuses of power, from corrupt police officers who terrorized communities to religious leaders who stole from the faithful. She had seen every type of authority figure fraud, from fake security guards who robbed their clients to coaches who used their positions to abuse children. But something about Karen Bishop had triggered her most powerful protective instincts. During their brief pre-show meeting, Karen had displayed the kind of calculated manipulation and casual cruelty toward victims that Judge Judy associated with the most dangerous predators in society. Her ability to seamlessly shift between authoritative intimidation and religious piety had set off every alarm bell in Judge Judy's experienced mind. The opening moments of the case had played out exactly as Karen expected. Judge Judy had reviewed the basic facts of the security service theft, and Karen had delivered what she believed was a flawless opening statement about the inherent challenges of providing security services and the unrealistic expectations of modern business owners. Judge, what we have here is a business owner who doesn't understand that professional security requires decisive action and proper authority. Mr. Williams hired a legitimate law enforcement professional with years of experience. When proper security protocols were implemented to protect his business from criminal activity, he decided to blame the security provider rather than address the criminal behavior in his own workplace. Marcus's emotional testimony about the fear and financial devastation that had consumed his business seemed to bounce right off Karen's armor of professional indifference. When Marcus broke down describing how his employees were afraid to come to work after Karen's fake arrests and deportation threats, Karen actually rolled her eyes and muttered something about criminals complaining when they face real law enforcement. Judge Judy's initial questions had been deceptively gentle, almost conversational. She had asked Karen about her law enforcement background, her security credentials, her coaching certifications. Karen had answered with increasing confidence, clearly believing she was educating this television judge about the complexities of maintaining authority and order in modern society. Your Honor, I've been in law enforcement and community leadership for over 20 years because I understand what society really needs. These criminals come to me expecting to be coddled and protected from consequences. Without experienced authority figures who understand proper protocol, these communities would descend into chaos and criminal behavior. The turning point came when Judge Judy pressed Karen about her jurisdiction for conducting traffic stops and why she had been stealing equipment from the very business she was supposed to protect. Karen's response revealed the depth of her contempt for anyone who dared question her authority. Judge, these people knew they were hiring professional law enforcement services. If they wanted guaranteed immunity from proper investigation, they should have hired private security without real authority. If they can't handle legitimate law enforcement protocols or accept responsibility for criminal activity in their workplace, maybe they shouldn't be running businesses. Actions have consequences, and some people need to learn that lesson through proper authority. It was then that Judge Judy asked the question that would seal Karen's fate. Ms. Bishop, in your 15 years of providing security and coaching services, how many complaints have been filed against you with police departments, coaching associations, or religious authorities for misconduct, theft, or abuse? Karen's answer came without a moment's hesitation or remorse. Maybe a few dozen complaints from criminals and troublemakers who couldn't handle proper authority. The complaint system is designed to protect people who refuse to accept legitimate law enforcement and moral leadership. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Karen seemed to realize she had revealed something deeply disturbing about her attitude toward the communities she claimed to serve, but her arrogance wouldn't let her back down. That's when Judge Judy leaned forward with the expression that regular viewers knew meant someone was about to be completely destroyed. That's very interesting, Ms. Bishop. Before we continue with this theft case, I think there are some things about your background in law enforcement and community leadership that might be relevant to your credibility as an authority figure. The transformation in Karen's face was instant and devastating. The smug confidence that had carried her through the entire hearing evaporated as Judge Judy opened a thick folder marked with Karen's full legal name and multiple arrest records spanning decades. Ms. Karen Marie Bishop, formerly Karen Marie Patterson, formerly Karen Marie Johnson. You have quite an extensive criminal history involving authority figure fraud that I think is very relevant to this theft and impersonation case. Karen's mouth fell open as Judge Judy continued with surgical precision. Impersonating a police officer in Michigan, conducting over 200 illegal traffic stops, sexually assaulting female drivers, and extorting money from immigrants who feared deportation. Previous impersonation charges in Ohio where you operated a fake police department and collected illegal fines from terrified citizens who believed you had legitimate authority. The courtroom erupted in gasps as Karen's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. Judge Judy wasn't finished. Systematic abuse of minors while coaching youth sports, 17 confirmed victims of sexual abuse, scholarship fraud, that stole college opportunities from deserving athletes, and previous misconduct charges that were covered up by corrupt officials who accepted bribes. And my personal favorite, serving as a fake ordained minister while embezzling $750,000 from 3 different congregations, evading taxes on stolen funds, and using religious authority to sexually abuse vulnerable parishioners seeking spiritual guidance. Judge Judy's revelation continued with devastating detail. You served 6 years in federal prison for mail fraud, impersonating a federal officer, and conspiracy to commit organized fraud across state lines. You were released just 2 years before establishing your current criminal operation. Tell me, Ms. Bishop, did the families who trusted you with their security and their children know they were paying a convicted felon who had been banned from positions of authority in 6 states? Karen's voice came out as a strangled whisper. That's in the past. I've been rehabilitated. I'm serving my community now with legitimate authority. Judge Judy's response was swift and merciless. Have you? Because stealing from clients while threatening them with fake arrests sounds exactly like your old pattern of authority figure fraud. Using forged credentials, intimidating victims with deportation threats, and exploiting immigrant communities' respect for law enforcement. That's not legitimate authority. That's continuing criminal enterprise targeting society's most vulnerable populations. The courtroom erupted in chaos as Karen stumbled out of her chair, her face ashen and her hands shaking uncontrollably. The woman who had spent decades destroying lives through systematic abuse of authority had been reduced to a trembling shell of her former self in less than 10 minutes. Judge Judy's final ruling was swift and devastating. Mr. Williams, this court awards you $45,000 for stolen property and fraudulent charges, plus $20,000 for business losses caused by illegal intimidation of your workers, plus $15,000 for emotional distress to your family, plus $25,000 in punitive damages for systematic abuse of authority. Total judgment, $105,000. Ms. Bishop, you are a predator who has spent decades systematically abusing positions of trust and authority to exploit innocent families. This court finds you guilty of theft, fraud, impersonation of law enforcement, and conspiracy to operate a criminal enterprise targeting immigrant communities and vulnerable children. The audience's reaction was immediate and electric. Spontaneous applause broke out as Marcus Williams collapsed into tears of relief, finally vindicated after months of fighting for justice against someone who had used fake authority to terrorize his family and destroy his business. Social media exploded within minutes of the show airing, with clips of Karen calling Judge Judy stupid going viral across every platform. The hashtag authority figure Karen began trending as millions of viewers shared their own horror stories about corrupt authority figures and celebrated seeing the ultimate badge-wearing predator get her comeuppance. Back at Bishop Security and Youth Services, the fallout was swift and merciless. Within 6 hours of the episode airing, federal agents raided Karen's facilities and seized all equipment, uniforms, and fraudulent credentials. The FBI launched investigations into her impersonation activities across multiple states. Youth sports associations immediately banned her from all coaching activities and began investigating historical abuse claims. The IRS opened criminal proceedings for tax evasion on her stolen religious donations. Over 300 former victims contacted authorities after seeing the show, providing evidence of abuse and fraud that dated back to Karen's earliest criminal enterprises. The federal investigation revealed the full scope of her multi-decade criminal operation, focusing on her systematic exploitation of immigrant communities and abuse of children who trusted her authority. 6 months after her humiliation on national television, Karen Bishop's criminal empire had been completely dismantled. The federal investigation had resulted in charges for racketeering, mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to impersonate federal officers, and systematic violation of civil rights across multiple states. Her personal assets were seized to pay restitution to victims, with the total damage estimated at over $15 million across hundreds of families. The various law enforcement agencies had shared information that revealed the full scope of her multi-decade criminal career, resulting in federal charges for operating a continuing criminal enterprise specifically designed to exploit society's respect for authority figures. She faced potential life imprisonment for her pattern of predatory behavior targeting the most vulnerable members of multiple communities. Meanwhile, Marcus Williams and his family had received not only financial justice but also support from immigrant rights organizations who used his case to educate communities about authority figure fraud. The publicity from the case had connected them with other families whose trust had been violated by corrupt authority figures, creating a support network for survivors of systematic abuse. The case became a landmark moment in authority figure accountability, studied by federal investigators and civil rights advocates as the perfect example of how career predators exploit society's respect for law enforcement, religious leadership, and youth coaching. Judge Judy's methodical destruction of Karen's facade reminded viewers that dangerous criminals often hide behind badges, uniforms, and religious authority, and that real public safety requires investigating beyond surface claims of legitimate authority. This story proves that no matter how sophisticated a criminal enterprise becomes, justice eventually catches up with predators who exploit society's most sacred trusts. Karen thought calling Judge Judy stupid would intimidate her into accepting surface explanations of legitimate authority and security services. Instead, It triggered the most thorough criminal background investigation of her career, exposing decades of systematic abuse that had been hidden behind the respected facade of law enforcement and community leadership.